and welcome back to our virtual summit on resilient and regenerative food systems. We are on week 2, and we've had a very interesting week so far. On Monday, we had a keynote address by Dr. Catherine Lambe, who is the Africa Program Director for the Master Harvest Program. Yesterday, we had a very interesting panel discussion on inclusive partnerships for sustainable and regenerative food systems with Better Food Foundation, 50 by 40, and also with some input from SLYCAN Trust. Today, we have a very interesting keynote address by Dr. Anna Grichting, a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Vermont. So how this will take place is that Dr. Grichting will be giving her presentation, and then if you all have any questions, we'll be opening up the chat and the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, then you could type in that. And for those joining us on Facebook, welcome. Please do submit your questions, and we will bring it forward to the plenary. So thank you, and over to you, Dr. Grichting.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Sanashia, and thank you very, very much also for the invitation to present my work. I will be sharing my screen now for the presentation. So I will be talking from the point of view of an architect and urbanist, and also as an educator. I just apologize. I just need to go back to the first slide. Yes, here we are. There we are. So yes, you can see the slides. Thank you. Yes, so I will be presenting my work on food, water, energy, and a waste nexus, and also talking about the importance of biodiversity in soil. So just to introduce, obviously we're in the context of the pandemic, and which has highlighted our dangerously unbalanced relationship with nature. And also as an architect, urbanist, and planner, I'm convinced that every intervention that we make in our territories should be an opportunity to restore nature, as well as obviously respond to the needs of our societies. So as designers, we can create ecological projects and systems that address the food, water, energy, waste nexus. So we use our resources more efficiently, but we also address threats such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and public health, especially important today. And in these projects, we should integrate plant, animal, and human communities in a respectful and balanced symbiosis that is agile and resilient to future threats and changes. So obviously we many of us have read this report on climate change and land from the International Panel on Climate Change. And obviously the production of food is and especially farming, intensive farming, is one of the largest uses of land and creation of greenhouse gases. There's also the report in 2019 on biodiversity, the UN report, and an unprecedented species extinction rate, which is accelerating. And today, obviously, urban health, or whether it's urban health, rural health, immunity. So we're also talking a lot about this, and also this is bringing up the relationship we have with all living species, with animals, and then also the healthy ecosystems that we need to create. There was already another respiratory syndrome, the MERS, and it already highlighted, this was in the Middle East, the relationship, the unbalanced relationship between man, the environment, and animals. So when I was during the pandemic doing some research, this came up, the small is beautiful, because it's also revealing these pathologies in countries' economic, social, and political systems. This is a citation by Michel Foucault, how these pandemics can reveal our systems. Maybe things that we need to change in our systems. And the small is beautiful is also that we did see how all these global systems, these interdependent systems, are not always very resilient, and perhaps that we need to also think about the scale of our infrastructures, whether it's food, water, energy, waste, and rescale to have more resilient systems. So we see that also mixed land uses, these are more flexible uses, more integrated uses, and also integrating economy, ecology, and public health. So these are a few of the themes that I work on, which is landscape urbanism, multifunctional landscapes, regenerative systems, systems thinking, biocultural diversity, obviously talking about biodiversity, but also cultural diversity, which is diversity of communities. The soil biomes, as I just mentioned earlier, rescaling infrastructure, and then also the relationship between the urban and the rural, which is very important to address, and the co-creation of resilient landscapes, so that it's not just the planners or the politicians, the urbanists, the specialists, but it's really also the communities, how we are creating these systems and landscapes together. So landscape urbanism is what I teach also to my students and apply, is that in fact landscape's always been seen as the icing on the cake. Whenever we have any projects, usually landscape comes afterwards, and when there's not much money, it suffers. But I think more and more we are seeing, and this is also being applied today in the leading landscape in our urbanism field, is that landscape is actually the foundation of any type of intervention, whether it's architectural, urban, etc. And this means also looking at productive landscapes for humans and obviously all species. Also water management, the importance of integrated water management from the ground up, and then also biodiversity. And obviously also that we are looking at the circular metabolism of systems as opposed to the linear systems that we've had in the past. So I do believe that our future as humans and the future of our planet and our landscapes will not be determined by our economic growth and territorial expansions, but by how well and how fast we can regenerate our ecosystems. So as we've seen in all the climate strikes and the youth who've been out on the streets, obviously before this pandemic, but there is no planet B. So that's one of the reasons we really have to work on in all our projects on regenerating the ecosystems. And the Anthropocene, why do we say beyond? Because it's really this where man has been at the center or at the top of the pyramid, and beyond means we have to do more than is expected. And now we are in maybe in an emergency, so we really have to go beyond what is required or expected in this regeneration. And so here's some from the ecologist that they're talking about the unleashing of microorganisms from the animal host mean that they must latch onto other bodies. Humans are part of nature and everything is connected to everything else. The current pandemic is just one aspect of the human-made planetary crisis known as the Anthropocene. Runaway climate change, biodiversity loss are others, and all are connected. COVID-19 confronts us with a civilizational crisis so immediate and so severe that the only real strategy will be one that can reach into and heal the web of life. So this is in a way this opportunity. And here this is a graphic representation of going from this ego or anthropocentric view where man is at the top of the pyramid to really one where he is part of the whole ecosystem, this symbiosis. So the balanced symbiosis is that projects should integrate plant, animal, and human communities in a respectful and balanced symbiosis that is agile and resistant to future threats and changes. So some people have talked about this as the Symbiocene. So man designing, so we go from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene, man designing in symbiosis with nature. As the Anthropocene we have seen is inherently unsustainable. So biophilia is an interesting concept that was coined by E.O. Wilson. And why is this important? It means that really that we seek a connection with nature and other forms of life. So in a way, maybe we need to re-nurture that real connection, which means that we will, our actions will also be in respect for all the forms of life. It's the urge to affiliate with the other forms of life. And this is someone who influenced me. He's an artist animal artist in Geneva, but he was also one of maybe our first ecological thinkers. He wrote many books on this, and he also was part of founding Pro Natura. So we used to spend time in his workshop. And I think personally for me, it was a way that I maybe developed also this intimate relationship with nature. This is in French, so I won't cite all this. So biodiversity, we mentioned this earlier. And as we can see, this is in Geneva, the UN. We can see now that this is being integrated into the city as well. And we see here the UN, they now have prairies and the sheep grazing. So in a sense, this prairie is not just creating biodiversity for the bees, all the insects, but then afterwards it becomes also food for the sheep. So here we see this also the relationship between the food and the biodiversity. And also in design profession, in the academia, there are also more and more people. This is from the AA in London, is the idea of co-creating with animals. So we're actually starting to look at this from the design, this co-creation with species. We mentioned earlier the biomes. So the idea is also linking the soil biome and the gut biome. So there's been more and more theories about this, and the idea is that a healthy gut is also important for a healthy immune system, and a healthy gut is also linked to a healthy soil biome. So we're seeing these interlinkages, which could have also relationships to pandemics, meaning that if we create these healthy ecosystems, we can also be more resilient to the pandemics. These are just some diagrams of, does soil contribute to the human gut microbiome, which is obviously has been proved to be very essential in immunity. So we can see also the importance of the soils, not just for producing healthy foods, improving the gut biome, but also addressing climate change and capturing carbon. Now, I want to mention an artist that has influenced me a lot, because I also work in many disciplines, and I've worked with the art school in Geneva. I'm also a musician and performance artist. And it's also important to have these approaches from art and science. And Beuys was an artist in Germany. I'm showing this coyote because this was during the lockdown in San Francisco. And Beuys in 1974 did a performance called I Like America and America Likes Me. This was his first visit to America. He never touched the soil, but he was in a gallery with a coyote. And then he flew back out, but he never stepped on the American soil. But his performance was talking about the relationship of America with the indigenous peoples, and also with the species, the animals. The coyote is a very important species for the the Native Americans. And so it's really interesting to see this performance, this way he had of thinking. And also he was an activist. He was saving the woods. He was also saving wetlands. This was in 1972. And what's interesting and maybe lesser known is that he was one of the founders of the Green political party in Germany. So really starting this whole movement about bringing, the environment into politics. So I work also on borders, and what's interesting, I've worked on the Berlin Wall many years ago when the wall fell, but in the 1970s there was Berlin was confined, and Herbert Sukop, who was a biologist, started to have to study inside Berlin because he could not go outside of the city to study the ecosystems and wild plants, etc. And in fact, that's how the whole concept of urban ecology was then born. And so we can see this interesting fact of the crisis and the confinement, and in fact the emergence of urban ecology. So we can see this lockdown. This was in March, but obviously we're now in a second wave. But just showing how all of a sudden we never imagined that we would be closing borders. And on the other hand, the lockdown has seen all these wild animals coming back into the city. This is in Japan. This is in North Wales, these Kashmiri goats roaming around the city, a puma in Santiago, and as we saw, the coyote in Los Angeles. So, what does this mean about rewilding the urban? It's interesting to see that, in fact, these are very important, the 5Bs, for biodiversity, but also for pollination. So therefore, for the production of food. And it's been said that even bee populations, there are more and more urban hives. And it is said that sometimes the bees in cities or in urban areas are actually healthier than in the rural areas. And that is also because of the intense agriculture and the use of pesticides. So it's interesting when I mentioned the urban and the rural, to see that in a way, because some cities are biodiversity, maybe they're becoming better ecosystem for certain species because the countryside is still using the pesticides. This is another example at the AA of designing, the animal coexistence, how architects, planners, designers are starting to design with this coexistence. This is an image of Tatarstan where I visited last year, and this is interesting. It's a combination of industrial landscape. This is the oil. This is where they're extracting oil. Tatarstan is very rich in oil, but it's also a rural landscape, as you can see. And when I was driving through here, so there's a lot of crops being grown in the middle of the industry, I found all these butterflies, thousands of them on the road that were dying. And then I realized, in fact, what was happening, it wasn't the petrol industry probably, but the use of the pesticides. So I was blessed to hear Vandana Shiva speaking in Qatar when I was there. And obviously she's also highlighted the dangers of monoculture, not just for the species of the agricultural species that we are growing, but also for the destruction of biodiversity, natural habitats, and production of greenhouse gases. So she talks about tomorrow's biodiversity. And here we can see the impact of organic farming on biodiversity. So just also showing the importance of these butterflies and other projects where architects are actually designing facades for endangered species, the monarch sanctuary. All of a sudden in a city, this facade becomes a monarch sanctuary. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. We're going back to the borders, but this is a project that developed with some students in the buffer zone in Cyprus. I won't go into telling you the whole political situation. These are buffer zones in areas between North Cyprus and South Cyprus, and you can look up the Cyprus conflict. But it's a buffer zone, which is still under the UN. And what I've been developing over many years is different scenarios to create a sort of ecological project in this green belt. There are a lot of endangered species that have taken up. This is a haven for endangered species because there's no more intensive farming and agriculture, etc. And one thing we started to look at was looking at also how do we look at this buffer zone in the future, looking at it as an ecological infrastructure for the food, water, energy and waste nexus. So very quickly, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the scenarios, but the idea was identifying organic waste, areas where we can recycle different types of waste, looking at building waste, concrete waste, the urban waste in the cities, and then also actually the mines, the abandoned mines. So what do we do with this also industrial waste? This is one example in the ghost city of Varosha, an abandoned city. So the idea was using the concrete, recycling the concrete and making sort of new public spaces on the edge of the city with the recycled concrete. I'm just showing you one of the projects. Also then the water infrastructure, of course, like many places in the Mediterranean and obviously in the Middle East, there's water shortages. So it's looking at different forms of water, and also the restoration of the riparian areas, the mines. So how do we actually create new wetlands by repurposing, remediating these copper mines, using stormwater, managing stormwater in the cities, wetland remediation, and the reuse of, as we mentioned, stormwater. This is one view of the sort of remediation of the copper mines, which were actually associated also with Aphrodite and Venus. So it becomes a sort of new cultural landscape. And we're also looking at obviously the energy infrastructure, solar energy, geothermal energy, biomass energy, and how this can be also integrated into these visions. Obviously, there's a lot of sun, so solar energy is one of the most obvious to be integrated. As well as biomass, etc. And so then the food infrastructure. So, we have different forms and sources of food. One, of course, is also fishing. So the idea of having maybe floating fish farms and creating organic farming zones in the buffer zone. So the idea that this green zone would only be integrating organic farming. So it becomes a sort of a backbone and a showcase for organic farming in Cyprus, and including then places to meet, farmers markets where the products can be sold. Now we're also going to talk about the Korean Demilitarized Zone. It's also a border I've been working on, and here what's interesting here is we also have a regeneration of ecosystems in this demilitarized zone, because it's been abandoned and under sort of the military presence, the UN. So here you can see this 4-kilometer wide zone. And what's interesting here is this is a similar view in Cyprus. So you can see also the fields, the agricultural fields, and then how it's interrupted by the buffer zone. Now, what's interesting between North and South Korea is they still have one common festival, which is the Harvest Festival in North and South Korea. So obviously, as they've grown, apart in culture and politics, etc., there are still common festivals, and this is a very important ancient festival. Also, there are also sacred species like the cranes, and these red-naped cranes are endangered species, and there are still dances that are performed in relation to that. So there are some interesting projects for the restoration and preservation of these endangered cranes, because as you can see, they fly on their migratory paths and stop in the DMZ. And what's interesting is that in these areas, the projects by the International Crane Foundation has been working on the preservation of these cranes. And here you can see some rice that's grown in the DMZ, and there's been several prizes won for the rice grown in the DMZ, because obviously it's grown in a much more organic way. And this rice is very important because in fact it's what the cranes feed on. And so it's really important to not plow these fields and to leave once the rice has been harvested. So this is left there for the cranes. So why am I highlighting this? I was very blessed to be able to see these dancing cranes in the DMZ. And why is it important? Because here we see that the food is grown in an organic way, and then is left as food also for these endangered species. So here we're highlighting also this balance between what we're growing for humans to consumption, but also leaving enough for the endangered species. So for a way that, for me, in a way, this is a symbolic dance, and we can see this project, which is on both sides being undertaken in North Korea and South Korea. As the North Korea and the South Korea, these two cranes sort of dancing together and in the future. So bioremediation, these are just a few projects. As we can see here, the flamingos, this is a salt mine in Montenegro. But what's interesting here is you can see that also the bioremediation is also to serve the migratory and endangered species. Here you can see the project of this bioremediation. So it addresses many different sort of productive landscapes, but also for biodiversity. And I wanted to show this. This is a sort of an urban agriculture rooftop farm in Asia. And it was actually, Kochakorn is a student. She was actually a student when I was a fellow doing my PhD in Harvard. And so it's one of her projects. So I'm interested to highlight this. And it's the rooftop of a university. And so here she's actually using the rice paddies. And it's also what we call a multifunctional landscape. In that it's managing the water and the storm water, and at the same time you can see the water management here, and also then feeding people from a single rooftop. So it's also producing rice for the community, and at the same time obviously bringing in different species. Now somebody else, Turinscape, which is Kon Jianyu, who I also was a colleague at Harvard, so he also works very much with the water, with ecology, with the productive landscapes, rice, and using ecological infrastructure to remediate the systems, provide cultural, social, and obviously, productive services to communities. So now I'm going to talk about a few projects in Qatar, where I was teaching for 7 years, that we developed with our students and some research grants. So there was a blockade in Qatar in 2017 where the borders were closed, and this was also really a crisis in the sense that the supply chains were interrupted, much as it's happened in certain ways in the COVID-19 crisis. This meant that they had to resource the food from different countries and reroute also the airlines, the ports were closed, etc. So they were said, well, maybe it prepared them better for the pandemic. And but the bioregion is a dry land, high CO2 emissions, but they have an abundance of energy. It's one of the world's largest exporters of liquid natural gas. A lot of food insecurity highlighted by the blockade. A lot of water insecurity. Water desalination is about 99% of the water sources, and 2.7 million population. So as we mentioned, this was a closing of the routes of all the blockage of the routes, and it sort of became an island. But it was also an opportunity. They decided, we need to produce much more of our own food. And there was an increase between 2017 to 2018 of 300% in the production of Qatari farms. It was also an opportunity. Some people said, they decided to import cows, but it was also an opportunity to think about what kind of foods we eat and, what does it make sense to actually grow. And there's research being done at Qatar University on microalgae, for example, which are used in many, whether it's medicine, food, etc. So it's also the importance of looking at alternatives and less sources of food that use less resources. As I mentioned, the changing diets for a hot planet. So as we said, this was a boost to reducing food miles and producing their own food. This is food that I used to get from an organic farm, which was already existing before the crisis. So actually, when I arrived in Qatar in 2011, I already started to look at food urbanism, using the university as a laboratory. And then later this became a research project, an international research project, but this work started already in 2011, before the crisis, and people didn't really understand why I was talking about food, but when the crisis happened, then it was more understood. So I'll go quickly through this, but it was really looking at the university as a laboratory for the food, water, energy and waste nexus. So the student here, we're looking at the water systems. And as I said, small is beautiful, this idea of having more on-site wastewater treatment to make it more efficient, use less energy and more resilient. And also looking at the energy consumption, where is the energy produced, and the different landscape layers, the future possible productive layers. So here, as you can see, we were looking at the regenerative and edible campus. And we looked at this idea of the food urbanism. How can we transform landscapes into productive landscapes using the treated water? And so we were looking at different scenarios for different spaces in the campus, and also looking at food knowledge hubs. It was also creating knowledge around food. Qatar has been for many years talking about creating a knowledge society, knowledge economy, and because they're moving obviously from the natural gas, which is non-renewable, and creating a knowledge economy. So knowledge about foods. There was also this idea of how do we create knowledge in these public spaces with knowledge hub, with digital knowledge hubs, which calculate food miles and food prints for the students. And also looking at the green roofs, how we can use the green roofs. That's important also for the urban heat island carbon capture, because in a way we're reproducing the soil at the upper level. These are the different scenarios we had for the green roofs, obviously intensive roofs, productive roofs, different types, one's more for biodiversity, one's more for production. Once again here we're showing the water systems, how the cooling towers, as you can imagine in Qatar, there's a lot of water used for cooling systems. So these can be then used for the trees and also for the green roofs. So we can actually directly use this water in these productive systems. So these were some of the ideas for this energy, food, water, energy, but also waste. And using the master plan, the campus, to create this regenerative master plan, and using also different pilot projects across all the campus. As you know and imagine, there are a lot of faculty, students working around food, water, and energy. And so it's also a way to harness all these initiatives and bring in all the different stakeholders from the academic, private, government, and NGOs, and the different communities, because we also have not just students and faculty, but we also have the workers, the migrant workers, the suppliers, etc. So this idea was to create an urban farm and food forest. So we partnered with Turba Farms, and this is actually an organic ecological farm run by Mohammed Al-Qatar, and who's also a natural doctor and has a huge knowledge of plants, medicinal plants, endangered plants, and he's actually even saving plants that have nearly gone out of extinction in Qatar, local plants. So as you can see, it's more or less the same scale. So the idea is, how could we rethink the campus with this idea? So here we're visiting the farm with Mohammed, and this is a field that he said he managed to actually grow the whole year round using microalgae, using different local plants or local products, and also more recent knowledge to be able to grow food all the year round in this dry land and very extreme climates. So this is a model of the university. So the idea was, how do we start to rethink the university, looking at organic farming, permaculture, water machine, and looking at the different layers, as we mentioned before. So biodiversity, as we said, is really essential, as well as is the soil. So there is also the landscapes for biodiversity. And one of the things that we proposed is the creation of a food forest, because the food forest creates the shade for the food plants, but it also has the more resilience and biodiversity. So it's a concept that comes also from the permaculture. And here we were visiting the area in the university to make the food forest. This is just an example from permaculture, where you can see how using natural permaculture systems in areas in dry lands, you can actually create quite a productive system with very little water. So here we are visiting the area, and this is a workshop that we did with Nance Clem, Soul to Soil, from Chicago. She came to Qatar, and we actually built a compost heat with the gardeners, the technicians at Qatar University, with our students, with architects, with some school children. And this was actually implemented. So this is where we're looking at, obviously, at the waste, but how that becomes a resource for the food. And here we had a planting with our students. You can see the Nepali workers, the Nepali maids, the communities, the gardeners. So we're really including all the communities. As we said, it's designing for community with community. And here we are with a gardener, and this was a PhD student. She's a specialist in permaculture, where we're designing this permaculture garden in the College of Engineering with our students. So here you can see the actual the student project. This was designed by the students. And in this design, we were doing the soil analysis with the Environmental Science Center at Qatar University. So we did soil analysis, and we did also the climate analysis. And we spoke to the specialists in what we could actually grow in Qatar. So it was working with different specialists. And this was one of our permaculture specialists. We visited her compound because she transformed a compound house with permaculture. Here she's using water from the washing machine directly into the tubs to grow edible food. Here, these are all salads and things you can eat. And she also obviously grew bananas, papayas, etc. So this was a case study that the students and we could take back and say all of these things can be done in Qatar using permaculture. Now, I also work with Blue, the water, but it's this idea of, this is a chapter I've written, so if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share it, because it's different projects looking at blue design in the dry land. So it talks about biodiversity, but it's also a project we did for a treated wetland, constructed wetland with treated sewage water that one of my students took as a master's project. So here we're really looking at water and water treatment, and we created a project with our master's students. Here we're with Stephen Vallagrinis, who's urban and landscape designer, and who came and gave a lecture, and we did a charrette with him. We also created the Friends of Abu Nakla. This was based on the High Line. So the idea was how to empower the students to take on these projects and then bring them to the authorities. The idea that we have to identify the projects that need to be done and then bring them to the authorities. It's sort of a bottoms-up approach, not just the top-down approach. And with our students, we looked at all the species that naturally developed in this wetland over from 2002 to 2014, because this wetland was going to be decommissioned by the public works. And so what we did was to design, here you can see it's part of the new planned green belt in Qatar, and we designed a new ecological landscape, which included obviously food urbanism. It's also near the workers' areas in Qatar, so creating community gardens for the workers, creating habitats for the wildlife, etc. So we developed this project, and what was important, as I mentioned before, is that we actually were able to take it to the minister. So it took many years, but this bottom-up approach of identifying what needs to be done and bringing it to the authorities. As we said, it needs to be integrated in the communities. So this is with our students. We're visiting all the different greenhouses and places where food is produced, and then bringing this into the design of architecture, community gardens, etc., translating this into their designs. So looking at blue here, we also redesigned the Doha Corniche with a new interface. So this is addressing, as you can see, it's looking at water, energy, waste, and urban food. It's also addressing climate change, rising seas, and urban biodiversity. Here you can see that we created a softer edge. We're also bringing the seawater into the landscape. We're working with saline agriculture. There's also floating ideas with floating farms, oyster reefs. There are more and more projects with oyster reefs as ways to mitigate the climate change, the mangrove forests as well. And obviously this idea of saline agriculture, which is important because it means we're using less energy to desalinate water and then not putting all the salty brine out into the ocean. Blue urbanism is also about taking care of the ocean. And there is a center, these are some scenarios, there is a center for halophyte and food security in the Gulf, in the UAE, and this is a book that was produced in Qatar. So this is also an important way of looking at food, growing food with seawater, different ways of growing food. We're also looking at the treated sewage water. These are the networks of the TSC and how they can be used to create green belts. And so it's what we call the blue-green networks. And these are projects by our students for the future green belt of in Qatar, which also includes an agricultural green corridor and urban food. So these are just some illustrations of other projects where we're looking at the floating farms and repurposing also the oil and gas infrastructure in the future. So these are kind of future projects of regenerating these infrastructures. So I will stop and share my PowerPoint here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grichting. That was very insightful, and I think you spoke on a lot of different topics, I think, that we don't usually focus on. So just wanted to let everyone know who's joined in. You could drop your questions on the chat, or there's a little Q&A box, or those are joining on Facebook, please leave your questions in the comments. So until the questions come in, I just have like one question. So generally when we look at environment, climate change, especially in developing countries, architecture and engineering are not areas that would be focused on like, as a priority area. I mean, as part of our nationally determined contributions, we do have an area on urban city planning and human settlement. However, I mean, due to innovation, funding capacities, it's not always an area. And I think you did mention that in Qatar that you all did manage to get to the government level, but it's not always possible. So how does that, I mean, how does that relationship pan out? Like, I mean, apart from Qatar, do like other do you have any other, say, case studies or, say, developing countries where you have this sort of an integrated stakeholder approach to this issue?
Yes, I'm not sure if I have any concrete examples to give you just right off my head, but I could definitely look more into that. But I think yes, thank you very much for this comment. And I think what I tried to show in my presentation is for me it was really important, as I mentioned, biodiversity, soil, food, water, energy. And when I came to Qatar, I started working with my students, and I must say it wasn't always very well understood. And even applying for grants is not easy because the categories are never really there. So I would say it was then in 2018 when I received this grant for the Food, Water, Energy Nexus, because now the big funding agencies, for example, Belmont and the European Union, have started to talk about the nexus, and that was important because obviously urban design, architecture, landscape urbanism, which I talk about, is an integrated discipline, so and in my teaching I've always tried to talk about the systems, integrating systems, and so I've been doing this in my teaching for since I was in Qatar, because I think it's really the way we need to be going and the way we need to be thinking. So I think now the funding agencies are looking more and more at the nexus, because before, it was food was very much based on technology, very little on communities, very, very little. And water, probably the same. Obviously, there are some initiatives, water saving, etc. And energy the same. And then waste was not very, very well addressed. Obviously there's no composting in Switzerland. So I did an event also at Qatar University where I had an exhibition and a panel, and I brought specialists in rooftop design, and we brought a composting drum that we put on the roof as a demonstration. So what I'd like to say, maybe as an answer, is I've seen it's a very multi-pronged approach, and which is what I was doing in Qatar. So on the one hand, there's the teaching to the students, transmitting all of this. The second, as you can see, and I did show some of the media, it's not to show off, but to say, then, talking, getting the ideas out there, talking to the media, talking wherever you can, because it needs to get, really, people need to hear the message everywhere. I also participated in a lot of professional conferences. So for example, the stormwater and drainage conference in Qatar, I was actually became the chairperson, which was a bit strange because I'm not a water engineer, but this is also how I met the water engineers, who then I invited, and they showed us, what they were doing, and our students then created projects around what the engineers were doing. So I think this is how we created, some very interesting and productive synergies. So I was also always very much, I always took up all the invitations in the industry to be able to have that real connection where the real information or what's going on is being done. And then also working, with the communities, with social media. For example, I worked on a turtle conservation project. And for National Day, we used to do events also with the students and the children, and the students use a lot of social media. So I'm also encouraging them to use the social media. So it's as I'm trying to explain, it's really working on different levels, and meeting the minister took a long time. I'd forgotten the project, and all of a sudden it was, somebody said, oh, they're interested in this project that you've done with your students, and this project I've been talking about in the media, publishing, etc. But so for me as an academic, it's not just about publishing in scientific journals, but it's really about communicating in every way that we can, and transmitting to the students, obviously.
Right. Thank you very much. So if you could maybe have a look at the chat, we also have some questions there. So we'll start off with the first one that Dennis has asked. Maybe if you could have a read.
Yes. So the first one, it's interesting to see that there is a strong link between biodiversity and food systems. Are there any precautions that should be taken when designing and implementing projects to decarbonize food systems to ensure that biodiversity is not negatively affected? Yes, so I think here what's important again is that the food systems must really think about the biodiversity whenever we're implementing them, and which is why I was talking about maybe landscape and landscape urbanism. I think before we integrate any kind of food system is we have to see where we are, what are the species that are there, etc. And then also what are we using for these food systems. I showed that diagram is how organic systems benefit biodiversity. And then there's obviously all the work by Dr. Vandana Shiva, and which is also the kinds of crops that we're growing and how we're, putting different crops together, not having monocultures. So I think all of these are really important. We use the concept of permaculture, but it's kind of a lot of traditional ways of doing things. For example, the way my mother was growing food, she always grew food, was very much using a permaculture approach as well. So you can look at permaculture, which is now being done at very different scales, but you can also look a lot at the traditional knowledge, which I'm sure we have in every country, which was also respectful of nature. I hope I could answer the question.
Yeah. So maybe we'll take the rest of the questions on the chat.
So, what are the factors that should be considered when initiating green roofs, and what are the challenges that have to be faced after implementation? Yes, so there are many things, obviously, because it all depends on the type of structure, the budget, etc. But there are a lot of initiatives that you can see which are low tech, because of course we have very high tech solutions, but we have also low tech and more regenerative solutions. So of course, what's always important if you're an architect and structure is the structure. You have to see, what kind of weight you can put on it, because you're going to be putting, water, soil, pots and plants, because you can do, a green roof can be simply just putting different, it can be mobile, it doesn't need to be actually, a permanent one. It can be more, mobile elements. But obviously the thing is, if you're using water, your roof anyway should be well insulated, for the rain and the water. So you have to be very careful about that. So I think it's really seeing obviously what can grow, also knowing how much maintenance when you're creating a green roof. First of all, do you want it to be productive? Do you want it to be for biodiversity? Or do you want it to be high maintenance, low maintenance? So there's all of these things to see, and there's a lot of, I think you can find a lot of information about that. And what's interesting is, a lot of do it yourself. You can really, even whether it's a terrace, a roof terrace, etc. There's a lot that can be done, with minimal cost, minimal implementation. It's just, I think, probably the most critical thing is the weight, and making sure you don't overload your roof.
There's another question on land use that Dinetra has asked.
Yes. So of course the livestock. This question is, land use is a huge problem faced by the food sector, especially the livestock sector. How do you think we should tackle this problem to build resilient and regenerative food systems? Well, yes, the land use is definitely a very big problem. And I think I mentioned in my presentation the livestock sector, and I did show one is the diagram that we all know, obviously, is how much land it takes and how much the carbon footprint of the livestock. So I think it's also maybe having a better balance, saying how much, maybe we have to rethink the amount of livestock. Do we need as much livestock? And then looking, because what is livestock? It has many different, why do we need the livestock? Obviously it's a source of protein and other things that we need, but then it's looking, I think, at other sources. I think it's, for me, it would be also to look at alternative sources. It's not to say we don't need livestock, because as we worked with the farm in Qatar, Turba Farms, and they have also some livestock, one that is obviously adapted there. And it can also really participate in a regenerative system and permaculture. But I think it's it's the intensive livestock sector, and which I think is more problematic.
That's interesting because yesterday in our panel discussion on inclusive partnerships, we actually spoke about livestock sector as well as livestock feed and like land use for it. And one of the elements that we've been focusing on within these past 2 weeks has been the topic of just transition, especially when you transition into a more sustainable, regenerative food system. So, in terms of architecture, I mean, you've explained this, but of course, I mean, like I said earlier, we don't look at it from that lens. And I mean, we are not traditionally used to looking at it from that lens. And so, but how do you see architecture coming into this discussion?
Well, I think it's very important because I think the way we design buildings, landscapes, cities, communities, um, is we can really integrate the food, water, energy nexus and the waste into any kind of a building, whether it's a small building, a large building, whether it's a repurposing. As you could see, actually, I think that the example of this compound house in Qatar was just an example of how you can take a building that's not been built in a sustainable way at all, and just with some bathtubs and the knowledge of permaculture, you can actually create that into a very productive and very sustainable. So that's what I mean. I've written and I've transmitted that knowledge. And for me, because I'm an educator, I work also with students. So first of all, it's important that the students who are designing the future understand this, that this needs to be really integrated, that it's that we have to every small structure needs to give back to the environment. I'm always saying that the blue urbanism is not just about blue and water, but it was coined by Saatchi and Saatchi, and they said blue is going beyond the green. It's with the green, we're being passive, we're just doing a passive house, or having a neutral impact. But blue means we have to actually give back more to the environment than we're taking. So that's with my students. I was saying, we're not just passive, we're not just trying to be neutral, carbon neutral, but we want to give back even more to the environment. And a good building should give back something to the community, to the environment. It should create a good public space, and it should really give something to sustainability in the environment by cleaning the air, by fostering the biodiversity, by producing food, producing energy, etc.
And there's one more question by Dennis.
Okay. So there is an organization that developed a methodology to assess the cultural importance of dugongs and seagrass ecosystems for local communities, to integrate them into restoration and conservation efforts. Similarly, there is a recent study that used storytelling to understand gender disaster in Bangladesh. I think I didn't read the beginning.
Sorry. Is there a good methodology to work with?
Yeah, it's asking a good methodology to work with local communities in planning the kinds of buildings and landscapes you described, integrating sociocultural factors. If I have any best practices to engage with communities and understand their architectural needs. Yes, I think that's a great example you give about dugongs and seagrass. Absolutely. And that's why when I mentioned the turtle conservation project that we did in Qatar, we worked with undergraduate students and master students. So the undergraduates were working on pavilions for turtle conservation. So how do we create awareness around this? And we worked with the Environmental Science Center. So the students had all the science, and then they also translated it. How do we make communities aware? And then we were also working with obviously the scientists, etc., to develop the master plan. Another project I think is when we started to create the garden in Qatar University. As you saw the image, the idea was saying, how do we work with the Nepali workers, because they actually started growing spontaneously food on the roof when they saw that we were doing this on the ground with our students. And what's interesting is these Nepali workers often come from rural communities and farming communities. So you have a lot of the workforce in Qatar. And they spend a lot of time where they don't have very much occupation. So the idea is, if we create gardens for them in the university, they actually have the knowledge and they can grow things. So in a way, I don't think I stayed long enough on the stakeholders in the university, but this a sort of living laboratory at the university was one way of engaging with all different types of communities. And also, we also invited, when we did the workshop on the soil, there were also some children from schools, there were also some architects that came, and specialists. So the university was like a microcosm of maybe a bigger community. So these are some examples, but there are many. And I think also, I mentioned before, artists, working, like you talk about storytelling, you give some, excellent examples. I work, with art, with music. So we worked also in Qatar with public art. So we said, how can we use public art to communicate on food, or to communicate on turtle, or on biodiversity. So I'm maybe not so much in the storytelling, probably more in the art, the public art, especially public art has a big role. And I think also, talking about Joseph Beuys as an activist, that's why I sort of gave that example. I hope I answered in some way.
You did actually, and if there are no, okay, yes, you did. I think this has been one of the most fascinating sessions for me. I'm sure it has been for the others as well, because we do. I mean, like I said, it's not always an area that we look into when we talk about these issues, and we do have projects that we work on mangrove restoration and ecosystem restoration, but again, it's not. I mean, now it doesn't look like that holistic approach, because we don't always look at all of these angles, but it's been very fascinating. So maybe before we close, do you have any like last remarks that you want to say? Because I do see us collaborating in future again, depending on your availability, because it's been very great. So do you have any
Yes,
closing remarks?
thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about your projects. Actually, there are some mangrove, I had with our students, we also had some mangrove restoration projects in Qatar. So the closing remarks, I think just that, I think just continuing to collaborate together as much as possible. And I think understanding communication, understanding the different languages, for me, that's why when I, working with the water engineers, working with scientists, they're all different types of languages, and the importance of all these messages. Today we're seeing also with the pandemic, we have to listen to the science, we have to listen to communities, we have to listen to everything. So I think, the collaboration, the co-creation and communication, because I think co-creation is, working with communities, working with, all the communities, scientific communities, communities on the ground, all the animal communities, the plant communities. So yeah, that would be my maybe just the final words. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Christine. Thank you very much again for your time. So just to let everyone know once again, tomorrow we have another panel discussion on inclusive partnerships for sustainable and regenerative food systems, which has been a recurring theme. As Dr. Christian rightfully mentioned, I think stakeholder collaboration is the way forward, especially when we are looking at, the state of things today. So for tomorrow's session, we have Dr. Kusika Sugatapalli, who's a senior consultant at SLYCAN, so he's also on the call with us, as well as Dr. Amanda Katili. She's the manager for Climate Reality Project in Indonesia. So the discussion will be at 4 p.m. Indian Standard Time, or 10:30 a.m. GMT tomorrow, same time, here on Zoom or on Facebook Live. So thank you, Dr. Christian, once again for your time. This has been amazing, and we look forward to speaking to you again in future. So thank you all, and goodbye from us for now.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.